The guttural roar of a Lamborghini ripped through the early morning stillness, a sound so obnoxiously loud it vibrated in my chest. I didn't even flinch. Knew exactly who it was. Breen Sutton, the poster child for privilege, the overindulged offspring of Deleen Sutton, the HOA president who ruled our little suburban kingdom with an iron fist. He was at it again, using my perfectly manicured lawn as his personal shortcut. His low-slung sports car, an obscene display of wealth, carved deep, angry ruts into the emerald green grass, a deliberate act of disrespect. But this time something inside me snapped. The patience I'd carefully cultivated over years of quiet suburban life evaporated. I calmly placed my coffee mug on the porch railing, the ceramic clinking softly against the painted wood. I walked to the edge of the porch, my boots crunching on the gravel, watching the ongoing destruction with a grim satisfaction building in my gut. What young Breen didn't realize, in his arrogant, entitled haze, was that the shallow trench I'd meticulously dug across a portion of my lawn wasn't just a haphazard line in the dirt. It was a trap. And the next time he decided to treat my property like his own personal speedway, he was going to pay a price far steeper than he imagined. I've lived in this meticulously planned, cookie-cutter neighborhood long enough to understand how things worked. Every house was a variation on the same theme. Oversized suburban homes, impeccably neat yards, each enclosed by the same sterile white picket fences. The epitome of the American dream, or so they say. But what truly transforms a house, a mere structure of bricks and mortar, into a home? It's not the granite countertops or the stainless steel appliances. It's the memories that echo within its walls. And for me, every square inch of this place was saturated with the memory of Sarah. Sarah was my wife, my partner, my everything. We built this house together, our bare hands shaping it from the ground up. I remembered spending countless hours alongside her, pouring the concrete for the driveway under the sweltering summer sun, planting saplings that are now towering trees, debating for what seemed like weeks over the perfect location for her rose garden. Every single corner of this property held a fragment of her spirit, a tangible reminder of our shared life. She was gone now, taken too soon by a disease that robbed us both of our future. But when I stepped out onto the porch, especially in the early morning light, I could almost hear her infectious laugh, feel the warmth of her hand in mine. It was like she was still here, a benevolent presence watching over me in the quiet mornings as I sat with my coffee, observing the world slowly awaken. But lately, that hard-earned peace had been repeatedly shattered. Breen Sutton was more than just a nuisance. He was a walking, talking embodiment of the kind of problem no one wanted in their neighborhood. He was a 23-year-old trust fund baby, living proof that money couldn't buy class, respect, or common sense. He was the kind of guy who genuinely believed he could do whatever he pleased simply because he was wealthy enough to get away with it. I first took notice of him, like everyone else, when he acquired that ridiculous Lamborghini. The car itself was an insult, a blatant flaunting of privilege. But the real problem wasn't the car itself. It was how Breen operated it. He didn't just drive it. He wielded it like a weapon, speeding through our quiet neighborhood as if it were his own personal racetrack. And my lawn, for reasons I couldn't fathom, had become his preferred shortcut. Initially, I dismissed it as a one-time occurrence. Maybe he was running late for something important. I'm generally a reasonable person, capable of understanding the occasional need for haste. But then it happened again and again and again. Every single morning, without fail, I'd hear the unmistakable roar of that ridiculously loud engine, and there he'd be, tearing across my yard, leaving behind deep, muddy ruts in the grass as if it was some kind of twisted joke he was playing specifically on me. Each time, I'd reluctantly venture outside, survey the damage, and try to convince myself it was merely an innocent mistake. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Perhaps I should have addressed the issue sooner, but I hesitated, clinging to the naive hope that it would simply stop on its own. I attempted to handle it with the politeness and diplomacy that had always served me well. The next time I witnessed Breen brazenly driving across my lawn, I decided enough was enough. I walked over to his sprawling, McMansion-style house, determined to have a civil conversation. Confrontation wasn't in my nature, But this situation had clearly escalated beyond the point of passive acceptance. I rang the doorbell, and when he finally answered, he regarded me with a mixture of annoyance and disdain, as if I was deliberately wasting his precious time. He was clad in a stained tank top, looking disheveled and half asleep, as if I'd just rudely interrupted his beauty rest. I politely gestured toward the tire tracks marring my lawn and calmly requested that he refrain from using it as a shortcut. His response? A careless shrug of his shoulders. "It's just grass, man. It'll grow back." It was as if he hadn't even registered a single word I'd said. I stood there, feeling my blood slowly begin to boil, a sensation I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just about the grass anymore. It was about respect. It was about common decency. It was about the principle of not treating other people's property with utter contempt. He didn't care. He didn't care that I'd spent years working on this yard, cultivating it into a small paradise, alongside Sarah. He didn't care that this lawn represented something far more profound than a simple patch of grass. It was a part of my life, a part of our shared history. But I refused to lose my temper, to descend to his level of boorishness. Instead, I forced a tight smile, thanked him for his time, turned around, and walked back home, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I could feel the anger simmering within me, threatening to erupt, but I knew I had to remain calm. What good would yelling accomplish? It would only reinforce his perception of me as an overreacting, grumpy old man. The next morning, I positioned myself by the living room window, peering through the blinds, waiting. Sure enough, at precisely 6:43 a.m., Breen's Lamborghini came roaring down the street, and right on cue, it veered sharply, cutting across my lawn with reckless abandon. This time, it wasn't just a quick pass. He deliberately spun the wheels, churning up the grass even more, leaving behind huge, unsightly patches of bare dirt where the lush green grass used to be. I stood there, paralyzed, watching the car disappear down the road, the damage already irrevocably done. That was the definitive moment when I realized that enough was unequivocally enough. I had already exhausted all reasonable avenues. I had attempted to communicate with him, to appeal to his sense of decency, but he simply didn't care. And it seemed no one else cared either. The other neighbors simply averted their eyes, unwilling to get involved. The HOA, predictably, was utterly useless. Delene Sutton, Breen's mother, practically ran the organization as her own personal fiefdom, and she was just as dismissive and entitled as her son. Every time I attempted to broach the subject with her, she'd flash that insincere, practiced smile and utter those infuriating words. Boys will be boys. I knew I had to take matters into my own hands. I simply couldn't allow this blatant disrespect to continue any longer. This time, I wouldn't be polite. I wouldn't just ask. I was going to ensure that Breen Sutton fully comprehended the consequences of his arrogance and his utter disregard for my property. I didn't yet have a precise plan, but I was determined to formulate one. The next few days passed in a haze of escalating frustration. I'd wake up each morning, brew my coffee, and watch the sunrise, desperately hoping for a fleeting moment of peace. But every morning, without fail, I'd hear the dreaded roar of that damn Lamborghini tearing down the street, a constant reminder of Breen's contempt. It wasn't even solely about the lawn anymore. It had evolved into a matter of principle. I had worked too damn hard for everything I had. Sarah and I had poured our hearts and souls into building this house, transforming it into our sanctuary, and now some spoiled, entitled kid was treating it like his personal playground. I constantly reminded myself to remain calm, to meticulously document every instance of damage. But with each fresh tire track gouged into my lawn, it felt like Breen was deliberately slapping me in the face, mocking my helplessness. Day after day, I stood on my porch, watching the methodical destruction unfold. I started to obsessively track the timing. 6:43 a.m. Precisely. The Lamborghini would come screaming down the road, cut through my yard, and tear up another few feet of grass. It wasn't merely the physical damage that infuriated me. It was the blatant disrespect, the constant reminder that no one, not the neighbors, not the HOA, and certainly not Breen or his mother, cared about the sanctity of my property. Then, on the fourth day, Breen didn't just drive through my lawn. He made a damn donut. I watched in utter disbelief as he spun the back tires, sending clumps of dirt and shredded grass flying into the air like confetti. The car was practically sideways on my lawn, its rear end fishtailing wildly, kicking up dust and debris like it was performing in some low-rent stunt show. He didn't even bother to slow down. When he had completed his obscene display, he gunned the engine and sped off, leaving behind a perfect circle of destruction in the very center of my yard. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at the wreckage. It was as if something deep inside me finally snapped, a breaking point I hadn't even realized was there. The anger had been steadily building, simmering just beneath the surface, but this latest act of vandalism was deliberate, calculated. This wasn't an accidental lapse in judgment anymore. It was a conscious choice, a direct message. Breen was sending me a clear message, and I was no longer willing to sit back and passively accept it. I went into the garage, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I passed my workbench, my table saw, the router, the meticulously organized collection of woodworking tools I'd accumulated over a lifetime of craftsmanship. Everything was in its proper place, impeccably organized, a testament to my methodical nature. But today I wasn't thinking about woodworking. Today, my mind was consumed with thoughts of how to make Breen Sutton understand that consequences weren't abstract concepts that only affected other people. I pulled out my old notebook, the one I used to meticulously record work orders back when I was still actively accepting commissions for my carpentry skills. I began to write down everything, each incident documented with meticulous detail. The dates, the specific damage inflicted, the precise times of each transgression. I carefully measured the tire tracks, noting their length, width, and depth. 15 feet long, 3 feet wide, 6 inches deep at the deepest point. I took photographs from every conceivable angle, ensuring that my house number was clearly visible in each frame to irrefutably establish the location of the damage. This wasn't just about making a point anymore. This was about gathering incontrovertible proof. I wasn't going to allow Breen Sutton to ruin my lawn and get away with it scot-free. Not this time. I was done being polite. I was done passively asking for respect. Now, I was going to actively demonstrate what happens when you deliberately ignore someone who possesses the knowledge and skills to rectify a wrong. I didn't even wait for the next day. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across my meticulously maintained lawn, I was already composing a letter. It wasn't just any letter, hastily scribbled on a scrap of paper. It was a formal, professional document, carefully calculated to convey the utmost seriousness. I printed it on high-quality paper, the kind that had a substantial weight and texture, conveying the impression that I meant business. "Dear Mr. Sutton," it began, "I am writing to formally address the repeated and escalating damage to my property, which has been directly caused by your son's reckless and irresponsible behavior of driving his vehicle across my lawn. As you are undoubtedly aware, I have meticulously documented each incident with photographic and video evidence. The damage caused is not only profoundly disrespectful to me and my property, but it is also completely unacceptable within the confines of our community. Please be advised that any further violations of my property rights will inevitably result in swift and decisive legal action to prevent this destructive behavior from continuing. Attached, you will find a comprehensive collection of detailed photographs meticulously documenting the damage, along with a precise timeline of the events that have transpired. I trust that you will take this matter with the utmost seriousness and ensure that your son immediately ceases and desists from driving on my property. Regards, Sterling Caldwell." I signed it with deliberate care, just as I used to sign work orders when I guaranteed a job well done. No mistakes, no second chances. The next morning, at precisely 6:43 a.m., I was back on my porch, camera at the ready, my resolve hardened. Sure enough, as if summoned by some perverse ritual, the Lamborghini appeared, roaring down the street and cutting across my lawn like it owned the entire neighborhood. But this time I was prepared. I filmed the entire sequence of events, capturing every single second of his blatant transgression. I zoomed in on the tire tracks, the license plate number, and Breen's smug, self-satisfied face behind the wheel, grinning like he was untouchable. I immediately saved the footage to 3 different locations, a secure cloud server and 2 separate external hard drives. I wasn't taking any chances. This time, I possessed the irrefutable evidence necessary to hold him accountable. The sun had barely begun to peek over the horizon, but I was already standing in line at the local post office, clutching the certified letter in my hand. I could see the postal clerk, an older woman with reading glasses perched precariously on a chain around her neck, glance at the address on the envelope and raise a knowing eyebrow. "The Suttons, huh?" she remarked with a subtle smirk. "I've had a few letters go to that address over the years." I simply nodded, offering no further explanation. She stamped the letter, handed me my receipt, and I walked back home, feeling the tangible weight of the letter in my pocket, a physical representation of my determination. I'd done what I needed to do. I was done politely requesting that he respect my property. 2 agonizing days later, I received the tracking information from the Postal Service. It confirmed that someone had officially signed for the certified letter at the Sutton residence. I granted them an additional day just to be absolutely certain, but Breen didn't stop. At precisely 6:47 a.m., like a broken record stuck on repeat, the Lamborghini came roaring down the street once again. This time, Breen wasn't just carelessly crossing my lawn. He deliberately sped through it, the tires screeching in protest as he churned up even more dirt and grass, effectively mocking the formal warnings I'd so meticulously sent. I didn't even flinch. This wasn't solely about the grass anymore. This was about respect, about standing my ground in the face of blatant arrogance, and I wasn't about to back down. That afternoon, I placed a call to the HOA office, fully expecting to be met with the same bureaucratic indifference I'd encountered in the past. Unsurprisingly, I was immediately directed to voicemail. I left a calm, professional message outlining the escalating situation and formally requesting that the matter be added to the agenda for the next scheduled HOA meeting. The return call came approximately 3 hours later. "Mr. Caldwell." Delene's voice sounded artificially warm and patronizing through the speakerphone. "I think we should discuss this in person, don't you?" The next morning, at precisely 6:47 a.m. sharp, like clockwork, I stood by my living room window, watching Breen Sutton's Lamborghini approach once again. This time, however, I wasn't merely waiting to passively observe what would unfold. I was confident that I possessed all the necessary evidence to hold him accountable, and I was completely done with waiting for someone else to step in and resolve the issue. As usual, the car tore through my lawn, sending clumps of dirt and grass flying in its wake. But this time, Breen didn't stop there. He deliberately accelerated, the tires emitting a deafening screech as he spun them in place, carving a deep, circular trench into my already ravaged lawn. The Lamborghini's engine roared defiantly, and I stood motionless by the window, watching him methodically destroy what I'd spent years building and meticulously maintaining. Then it finally happened. Breen's front tires slammed directly into the hidden trench I'd so carefully and strategically dug. The car jolted violently, its front end scraping harshly against the unforgiving ground. He instinctively slammed on the brakes, but it was far too late. The tires spun uselessly, emitting a high-pitched whine, as the car sat hopelessly stuck, its undercarriage grinding against the unforgiving dirt. I calmly stepped outside, deliberately taking my time, savoring the moment. The sight of Breen desperately attempting to free his precious car from the trap was almost intoxicatingly satisfying. He wasn't laughing now. The engine sputtered and coughed, and for a fleeting moment, I simply watched him struggle, silently reveling in his predicament. He couldn't get the car out. That's when I heard the distant wail of sirens. Red and blue lights flashed dramatically down the street as 2 patrol cars rapidly approached, their urgency cutting through the morning calm. Breen immediately jumped out of his car, his face contorted with fury, and began pointing wildly at the immobilized Lamborghini. "You've got to do something!" he yelled at the approaching officers, his voice laced with panic and indignation. The younger of the 2 officers, his expression a mixture of confusion and mild amusement, cautiously stepped out of his patrol car, surveying the chaotic scene with a professional detachment. I didn't need to say much. I knew that I held all the cards now. I'd meticulously documented everything, and the evidence spoke for itself. I calmly pulled out my smartphone and displayed the videos I'd painstakingly recorded, showcasing crystal-clear footage of Breen's car tearing across my lawn, day after day, in a blatant display of disregard for my property. The officer carefully studied the footage, his brow furrowed in concentration, then looked back at me with a newfound respect in his eyes. "You've got everything documented here," he acknowledged. "This doesn't look like an accident anymore." Breen, still consumed by fury and denial, attempted to argue, desperately trying to downplay the situation. But the officer wasn't interested in his excuses. "I'm going to take a closer look at the car," he stated, his voice calm but firm. Breen's face visibly paled. As the officer crouched down, carefully inspecting the undercarriage of the Lamborghini, he stood up after a moment and fixed Breen with a stern gaze. "This car is definitely stuck. You're going to need a tow truck to get it out of here. And from what I can see, this isn't just a simple mistake anymore. We have a clear pattern of property damage here." As Breen launched into another round of vehement protests, the second officer, older and more experienced, turned his attention to me, offering a subtle nod of acknowledgement. "I think we need to take this a little further," he said, his voice carrying an air of authority. "The HOA can't just ignore this situation anymore." As if on cue, Delene Sutton, Breen's mother, appeared out of nowhere, clad in her silk robe and plush slippers, rushing down the driveway with an expression of disbelief. She immediately began yelling at the officers, demanding to know what was going on. Her voice shrill and accusatory. The older officer held up his hand, silencing her. "Ma'am, your son has been repeatedly trespassing on Mr. Caldwell's property. He's been warned about this behavior several times. We're calling a tow truck to remove the vehicle. This is over." I stood on my porch, my arms crossed casually across my chest, watching as Breen's carefully constructed world began to crumble around him. His usual arrogance and entitlement had completely vanished, replaced by a palpable sense of panic and desperation. The Lamborghini, once a symbol of his perceived invincibility, now sat helplessly trapped, like a broken toy. Delene attempted to argue further, desperately trying to leverage her position as HOA president to influence the situation, but the officer firmly shut her down. "This is a civil matter now, ma'am. If you have an issue with how we're handling this, I suggest you speak to your lawyer. But as far as we're concerned, it's over. Your son's behavior isn't just childish. It's illegal." Breen's bravado finally cracked, his eyes widening with the dawning realization that he couldn't simply bully his way out of this situation. The small crowd of neighbors who had gathered to witness the unfolding drama stood in stunned silence, their smartphones held aloft, discreetly recording the spectacle. It was a public shaming, a stark reminder that even the most privileged individuals were not immune to the consequences of their actions. A kid who thought he could do whatever he wanted was now realizing that actions have consequences. The tow truck arrived soon after, its flashing lights adding to the overall sense of chaos. Breen's Lamborghini was unceremoniously towed away, its visible damage clear for everyone to see. I didn't utter a single word. I didn't need to. The officers efficiently handled everything, their professionalism a stark contrast to Breen's childish antics. As they prepared to leave, the older officer paused, offering me a knowing look and a subtle smile. "Good job, Mr. Caldwell," he said quietly. "You did everything exactly right. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." The small crowd of neighbors began to slowly disperse, murmuring amongst themselves. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt the immense weight of frustration and anger lift off my shoulders. Breen's carefully cultivated sense of invincibility had been shattered. I had stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated, and it had ultimately paid off. The next morning felt strangely quiet. No Lamborghini tearing up my lawn. No angry shouting from Breen or Delene. The sun rose just like it always did, painting the sky with vibrant hues of orange and pink. But today, It felt like I was finally back in control of my own life, my own property. Breen didn't show his face. I didn't expect him to. His precious Lamborghini had been ignominiously towed away, likely sitting in some mechanic's garage, awaiting a hefty repair bill. That was his reality now. The arrogance he once wore like a crown had vanished, replaced by the crushing weight of his own poor choices, and he had no choice but to face the mess he had created. Deline, on the other hand, didn't let it go so easily. She posted a few passive-aggressive messages on the neighborhood social media group, lamenting how some people take things too far, and how we should all strive to get along. But I deliberately ignored them. She had always believed that she could simply talk her way out of any situation. But not this time. Her carefully crafted words no longer carried any weight. I hadn't planned to make a public spectacle of the whole affair. I certainly didn't aspire to be the neighborhood hero. I simply wanted to protect my property, to stand up for what I had rightfully earned, and to reclaim the peace and tranquility that had been so rudely disrupted. That was enough for me. It wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was simply about holding people accountable for their actions. The days following the incident were remarkably calm. The neighborhood felt noticeably quieter, but in a positive way. People waved more frequently, and I began to detect a subtle shift in how they treated me. They seemed to respect me more, perhaps because I had done something they hadn't been able to bring themselves to do. Stand up to the Sutton's reign of entitlement. I didn't actively discuss the events with anyone. I mostly kept to myself, focusing on the cabinet project I'd been diligently working on in the garage. Life was slowly but surely beginning to return to normal. A few days later, Ramona, my next-door neighbor, knocked on my door again. This time, she had a homemade pie with her. Apple with a delicate lattice crust, just like Sarah used to make. "Thanks, Ramona," I said, gratefully accepting the pie. She carefully set it down on my porch table and gave me one of her warm, genuine smiles. "You saved this neighborhood, Sterling," she said, her voice unusually serious. "People were afraid to speak up before, but now they know that they don't have to just put up with things." I didn't quite know how to respond to that. It felt good to hear, but I wasn't seeking praise or accolades. I simply wanted things to go back to the way they were. But Ramona wasn't finished. "You did what needed to be done," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "You stood up for yourself, and that's what matters." I smiled self-consciously and shook my head slightly. "I just wanted to protect what's mine." "Well, that's heroic in itself," she said with a wink. "You did what was right, even when it was hard, and now people know that." I didn't argue with her. She was probably right to some extent. But I wasn't in it for the recognition. I simply needed things to settle down, and they finally were. The neighborhood felt subtly different, but in a decidedly positive way. There was a new sense of respect in the air, a newfound willingness to stand up against injustice. People weren't afraid to speak up anymore. Maybe things had been broken for a while, and I just hadn't been fully aware of it. Then, the story took on a life of its own. Ramona came by again a few days later, holding up her smartphone with a mischievous grin on her face. "You absolutely need to see this," she said, turning the screen toward me. It was a post from the neighborhood social media group, featuring a photograph of Breen's Lamborghini, or what was left of it, sitting on the Suttons' perfectly manicured front lawn. The various detached parts had been carefully arranged, almost like a bizarre, avant-garde art installation. The caption read, "When you mess with the wrong neighbor, karma served cold in suburbia." I didn't even need to check the number of likes or shares. I could already sense it. People were sharing it, commenting on it, wholeheartedly agreeing with the sentiment. It had gone viral, at least within the confines of our little suburban world. I hadn't actively sought the attention, but it was hard not to feel a small sense of satisfaction. People were finally seeing Breen for who he truly was. A spoiled, entitled brat who had never faced the consequences of his actions. The best part was the accompanying video footage from the morning when Deline had confronted the police officers at my house. People were finally witnessing her red-faced and yelling at the officers, her carefully constructed facade of authority crumbling before their very eyes as the officers calmly explained the fundamental principles of property rights. That video spread like wildfire, even faster than the initial photograph. I knew it was a spectacle, but I couldn't deny the small thrill of seeing her exposed for the first time. By the time the HOA called their emergency meeting, Delene's position as president was in serious jeopardy. Ramona came by after the meeting and filled me in on the details. The board had voted to remove her from her position, effective immediately. It wasn't even a close vote. It was a resounding public rebuke. Delene had been unceremoniously ousted as head of the HOA, and the newly empowered board was finally stepping in to address the damage she had caused during her reign of incompetence. I didn't need to be there to witness it. The neighborhood had spoken, their collective voice finally being heard. The change had already begun, and I had played my own small part in facilitating it. As for Breen, I didn't see much of him after that. When I did happen to catch a glimpse of him, he kept his head down, his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. I think he had finally learned a valuable lesson, albeit the hard way. And as for me, I simply went back to my usual routine. Sarah's driveway was clean again, pristine, and utterly perfect. No tire marks, no unsightly ruts, no lingering damage. I stood out there one evening, admiring the smooth expanse of concrete, and it felt like everything had finally come full circle.